Today we're going to focus on the different properties of numbers. The commutative property of addition involves an exchange or substitution. So when we have a substitution, think about in a sports game. Someone's sitting on the bench, someone's playing. If we substitute the players, we switch them out. So the one that's playing is now on the bench. The one that's on the bench is now playing. This exchange or substitution in the commutative property gives you the same result, whatever the order. So we're switching the order. As you can see in the illustration, A plus B is a specific order. We switch them where A was first, now B will be first. And then B was last, now A is last. So we are switching or moving them, their positions, but it still gives us the same number. So changing the order of the addends, remember we are adding here, does not change the sum. So 4 plus 7, which is 11, is the same as 7 plus 4. As you can see in the practice example, it seems pretty basic, pretty easy. But 14 plus 29 is going to be the same as 29 plus 14. The second type of addition property we're going to focus on is the associative property. This involves the basic condition or focus of groups of quantities. So a grouping, as you're going to see in a little bit, is going to be separated by parentheses. So the group of quantities gives you the same result, whatever the order. And whatever this order of the grouping of numbers is involved in, it really doesn't matter. So if we put A plus B in parentheses plus C, that's still going to be the same thing as B plus C in parentheses plus A. Now, remember, parentheses usually signifies that we're going to do that part first. But with the associative property, we're going to do A plus B plus C, but because we're adding everything here, it doesn't matter, the grouping doesn't matter if we switch out things, letters, numbers, in the parentheses, it's still going to give us the same result. So changing the grouping, changing what's in the parentheses and what's out of the parentheses does not change the sum. So if you look at the example, 5 plus 4, that gives us 9. 9 plus 6 is 15. In the same way, if I switch out what's in the parentheses, I switch the 5 and the 6, okay? 4 plus 6 is 10, plus 5, that gives us 15. So here you can see the practice. I'm going to be switching out the 58 and 17 from the left side and the right side. So 58 plus 23, I go ahead and do the parentheses first, plus 17 would give me the same result if I have 23 plus 17 in the parentheses plus 58. So that's the associative property. Okay, the focus is on the groupings or what's in the parentheses being switched and changed for the grouping. Now the identity property of addition, and remember with these properties, these first three properties, we're only focusing on addition. And here we have the sum of any number plus 0, the sum of any number and 0 equals that number. So A plus 0 equals A, or you can have 0 plus A equals A. So any number plus 0 will give you the same number. Okay, so if I have 7 plus 0, it's going to give me 7. If I have 39 plus 0, it's going to give me 39. If I have 562 plus 0, it's going to give me that same number. Okay. Now, we will be doing some practice problems, and you want to try and see if you can do some of these mentally. If we switch things around, it's still going to give you that same number. So let's take a look at multiplying by the power of tens. And really, all this is if I change the number from 10 to 100 to 1,000, I'm just adding an extra zero. So really what you're going to do is you're going to multiply the non-zero numbers first, then you're going to add any extra zeros. So let's take a look at that with the first column there. 3 times 10. Okay, I'm going to multiply the first numbers. Okay, so that's going to be kind of like that front end number. 3 times 1 is 3. And then I look at how many zeros. There's only one zero. Okay, I add that. That gives me 30. Okay, let's look at the next one below that. 3 times 100. I multiply 3 times 1. That gives me 3. I have two zeros. That's 300. 3 times 1 in the 1,000. 3 times 1, 3. We have 3 zeros. That gives me 3,000. So very easy. All I'm doing is multiplying the numbers. Then I'm going to go ahead and add in as many zeros as I need, as there are in all of the factors. So let's take a look at 45. 45 times 10. So we do the 45 times 1, that's 45, 1 0, 450. 45 times 100, 45 times 1 is 45, and 2 zeros, 4,500. And I'm going to do the same type of thing with the last number, 45 times 1,000, giving me 45,000. And the same thing applies no matter how large the number is. As I have 128 times 10, I multiply 128 times 1, and then add a 0. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide here. And this is now going to repeat the commutative property. But instead of the commutative property of addition, I'm now going to focus on the commutative property of multiplication. Remember, it's still the same type of definition. The focus here is substitution or exchanging. So if I have A times B, that's the same thing as B times A. If I have 3 times 13, that's the same thing as 13 times 3. So changing the order of the factors does not change the product. So this is the same type of thing as the commutative property of addition, but here I'm multiplying. So 6 times 24 is the same as 24 times 6. Now let's look at the associative property of multiplication. And as I just said, we already went over the associative property of addition. Now we're focusing on multiplication. And again, associative property is focusing on the grouping, and that's dealing with the parentheses. So if I have 8 times A times B in parentheses times C, that's the same as if I switch the A and C, and I have B times C in parentheses times A, okay, that would be the same thing. So changing the grouping of the factors does not change the product. Okay, so that, just to clarify that the X, it's a little large, but that is the multiplication symbol, okay, the times. Okay, so 5 times 4 in parentheses, which is 20, times 6 is the same as 4 times 6 in parentheses times 5. And you can try the practice at the bottom. And then here we have the identity property of multiplication. Now we already looked at the identity property of addition, and here if I multiply and I look at the product of 1, and any number equals that same number. So A times 1 will be A. 7 times 1 will be 7. It's the same thing. Okay, it will always yield that number, and that's pretty easy. You learned that before. Whatever number times 1 yields that number. Now let's add a couple more properties that were not the same or not talked about with the properties of addition. This is the zero property. This property of multiplication focuses on the product of zero, and any number multiplied by it equals zero. So 7 times 0 will be 0. Okay? So anything times 0 will equal 0. So that's why they call it the zero property of multiplication. Now we have the distributive property of multiplication over addition. Now, distributive refers to sharing. Make sure you put a star or some sort of asterisk or underline so that you know that distributive refers to sharing. The product of a factor and a sum is equal to the sum of the products of the factor with each addend. That's a lot of stuff to take in. So we look at that and it may just blow right over our heads. Like, what is that saying? Okay, let's look at the illustrations. Let's just look at the pictures, okay? So instead of what we saw before where we had in parentheses, it was in the previous properties, it was B plus C, and then it had outside the parentheses, it had A plus, okay, parentheses B plus C. It was the same, right? Or it was A times parentheses B times C. But here, it's going to be different. What's happening here is that when you multiply something in parentheses, you go ahead and you can rewrite it in a longer version. So if I have A times parentheses B plus C, that's the same thing as saying parentheses A times B plus A times C. So it's kind of like that A has to multiply each of the parts of the parentheses. So that A has to take turns to focus on each of the parts of the parentheses. Okay, so let's take a look at the numerical example. 3 times parentheses 5 plus 8. So to rewrite this, I would say parentheses 3 times 5. Okay, I'm done with that part. But what about the 8? Plus, I go back to the 3 times 8. So that 3 will focus on the 5, multiply by the 5, and then the 3 will multiply by the 8. So if I have a 3 or a number outside the parentheses, that number on the outside will take turns each time with one of the numbers inside the parentheses. So the 3 will multiply by the 5, and then that's kept in the parentheses, and then the 3 will multiply by the 8, and that will be kept in the parentheses. But you have to focus on that positive that separates those two parentheses. And that will be the same answer as 3 times parentheses 5 plus 8. Okay, and then there's the little example or the practice down below. Okay, the product of 5 and 38. 5 times 38 is the same thing as saying 5 times, in parentheses, 30 plus 8. Now, because it says 5 times 30 plus 8, I must say 5 times 30, put that in parentheses, plus 5 times 8. So we have to give 5 and 8 its turn. So 5 times 30 is 150. 5 times 8 is 40. We add those together. That's 190. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and do some practice on Monday. But if you're not understanding or you need some extra help, on some of these properties, please do the practice work.